Short introduction about myself. My name is Bart van Kimmenade. I'm a product owner at itslearning. I've been that for almost 10 years now. I have a background in education, studied to become a teacher in primary education. After I finished that, I decided to study educational science and technology. And I've been in learning management systems since the previous century by now. So I've been around, so to speak. My wife is still a teacher in primary education, and my kids are also attending primary education. So education is still very much around me. But as I said, I've been working in learning management systems and with itslearning over the last 10 years. In this session, I want to talk to you about learning objectives and how they can help giving you better insight in curriculum coverage and progress. I'm expecting everybody has read the description of the session before signing up, but I do want to emphasize one thing first before I dive into it. In itslearning, we talk about learning objectives, and that's also the word I will be using in this session. But in different markets, they will have different names, and even in different educational programs, they can have different names. So maybe you talk about competencies, or I know in the US they talk about standards. Whatever the name is, in essence, what we in itslearning see learning objectives as is a way to describe what you want students to achieve. So that could be knowledge, that could be skills. In the case of competences, it's knowledge, skills, behavior. But in the end, the definition of what you want your students to achieve. And in this session, I would like to show you, it's a bit of a show and tell, how you can use learning objectives to plan your teaching, how you can use them to communicate your expectations to students, to assess their proficiency on these objectives, but also to gain insight in curriculum coverage, but also in progress on that curriculum. As Peter mentioned before, if you want to post anything on your social media, please use the hashtag itscommunity. We will use that hashtag to keep the discussion online, so to speak. In this session, if you have any questions, feel free to use the questions section that should be available in the toolbar of GoToMeeting. I'll go to webinar, I should say, and I will pause ever so often in this webinar or in this session to see if there are new questions and to answer them when they are relevant for that moment. If they're not relevant for this session, we will make sure they get answered over email in a later stage. So please keep those questions coming. And on my second screen, I'm monitoring what's coming in there. I do have a poll as well to make the session a bit more interactive, which I will launch now. You should also see that poll appearing in the side. So please try to answer that poll. It's about your experience with learning objectives in itslearning so far. Just to keep it a bit more interactive, but also give me a bit of insight to what extent you have worked with learning objectives in itslearning before. So I see if more than half has voted now. Keep them coming. So at this moment, we're around 2/3 has never worked with them and 1/3 has. All right, I'll close the poll now. So it's safe to say that around 2 out of 3 of you have never worked with learning objectives in itslearning before. So let's see if today can inspire you to get hands-on with these learning objectives and see what they can do for you. Now, the theme of this itsConvention is about raising educational quality. I want to point out one website here, Visible Learning MetaX. It's a website that gives access to the research of the Australian professor, John Hattie, and his visible learning research. And what John Hattie has done for, I think, about 2 decades now is analyzing research from others about influences on student achievement. So you can see maybe in the column here the number of studies versus the 277 results found. So we defined 277 influences on student achievement, and you can see the amount of studies about a certain influence. So these are hundreds, thousands of studies that have been analyzed by him. And what you can do there is filter on effect size, and the higher effect size, the higher the potential impact on student efficiency. So there can also be a negative impact, but I've filtered here on the positive effect side. So you see, for example, teacher estimates of achievement comes at the highest potential influence on student achievement. Now, not all of these are directly about learning objectives, and some are totally not related to learning objectives. But in these top tiers, there are a couple that touched upon learning objectives, and I do want to highlight some key points there. I'm using my own words here, but feel free, preferably after the session, to go to that website and look them up yourself and explore the site further. But one of those key points is teacher collaborations, teachers working together, discussing what works, what doesn't work, etc. And I want to show you also today how itslearning can facilitate that process, working together on the curriculum, on content, etc. Another key point is knowing where the student is. You may be familiar with the Goldilocks principle from the fairy tale Goldilocks, the little girl and the three bears, where the porridge, for example, is too hot or too cold or just right. And also here, knowing where the student is can help you define what's next, and making sure that what's next is not too difficult or too easy, but just right for the student, challenging enough, but not too easy, not too complex. So also here, I want to show you today how learning objectives can help you get insight where individual students are on the curriculum. Third point here, communicate expectations. By using learning objectives, by incorporating them in your teaching, you can also explain to your students what is expected of them, and how that relates to the bigger picture in your course. And the last point here, working towards student ownership. In the end, student achievement significantly increases if the student takes ownership of their learning, doesn't do something because the teacher says they have to, but actually feels like it's something that will improve themselves as well. And there are a couple of tools in itslearning that can help you achieve that change towards student ownership. So basically, how can learning objectives help with this? And in the end, help to increase student achievement and overall the educational quality. Before I dive into itslearning, a short introduction to learning objectives. What are they? Where do they come from? Now, in I would say all countries, learning objectives are made available by the government. So what we see here are two screenshots, kept them in English so everybody can easily understand them. One is from the United States, standards there for math, and the other one on the right is from the UK curriculum, might be outdated by now, but this is for English. So this is a description, basically what students are expected to be able to know or do to achieve at the end of a certain period of time, a grade or key stage, or however it's organized. I will touch upon this further in the presentation, but one thing educators should look at is whether or not these objectives are useful out of the box, or if these are maybe too generic, too broad, not specific enough, or if these objectives are written in a language that is difficult to understand, maybe even for themselves, but certainly for students. So using these objectives as is might not be the best approach. In my mind, when designing a course with learning objectives in mind, the first thing you should look at is basically what do you want your students to achieve, and try to define that in a way that's easy to explain to students, easy for them to understand. So once that is defined, you should look at the assessment. How do students show that they have achieved the goal? Or with other words, what's the evidence that shows that a student has achieved a certain goal? And lastly, how can resources and activities help with building knowledge and skills to eventually help students to achieve that goal? So I will fast forward a bit in time when working with itslearning, because of course it takes time to set this all up. But when working with learning objectives, to me, this is a sensible build-up in designing your course. And of course, for those of you not starting from scratch, that maybe already have courses with content in itslearning, you could look at a bottom-up approach and maybe start working with learning objectives for certain parts of your course and see how that works for you and your students. Now, getting started, I will show a few screenshots, but then dive into the live site to show you how that works in practice. Whenever I reach a section like this, I would like to take a pause, see if there are any questions coming in. I see at this moment there are no questions, but feel free to post them, and I'll see if I can answer them now or later in this session, or potentially if they're not suited to answer in public, then I'll make sure we answer them over email after this session. So getting started is all about adding learning objectives to your course. So again, I'll show this live in a bit, but in each course, you can go to the learning objective page, and on that page, you can create your own learning objectives from scratch then and there, but you can also find learning objectives. And if you click that find button, then the learning objective repository, as we call it, will open. And in there, you can find ready-to-use learning objectives from your country. Each local itslearning organization can populate, can manage the repository for their country. So if you see that a certain set or a certain framework of learning objectives is not available there, then please reach out to your local itslearning organization, and they can help you with populating it. In this example, I've navigated to the United Kingdom, again, to keep it English in this session. And I've selected the set of learning objectives for English Key Stage 3. So a key stage is basically a group of grades, and at the end of those grades, you should be able to achieve these goals. Not the way all countries have organized their learning objectives, just an example here. So and once I click Insert and Close, I have these objectives added to my course, and then I can start using them. So let me jump to the live environment. I've set up a couple of courses. One of them is this English 6A, where I do have some content, but if I go to more and then the settings page, I will see my learning objectives, and that's currently empty. So as I said, I can start creating objectives here. If you can't find objectives in the repository, this could be a way to do it, but I'll talk about a different way further down this session. For now, I want to focus on this find option. If you click find, then by default, the repository will open in the country, in the repository of the country that is associated with your itslearning site. And in this case, that's a Norwegian site, so a Norwegian repository opens. But for this session, I will again jump to the UK, so we can all read and understand the learning objectives. And I will select English Key Stage 3, like I did in my presentation on my slides, and I'll click Insert and Close. And then I have a whole bunch of learning objectives ready to use in this course. So back to my presentation. Once you've added those learning objectives to your course, it's the question, what can I do with them now? And a first step would be to align these objectives with your content. Again, if you have any questions, I encourage you to use the questions section in GoToWebinar. For now, I see there are none, so I'll just continue. So aligning content basically means connecting the learning objectives you have added to your course to content, and that can be plans, but it can also be the resources. So that could be an assignment or a file or whatever. So in here, maybe let's start with the purpose. So what's in it for me when you start aligning content? And the purpose, or one of the purposes here, is the alignment report. So in the title of the session, we talked about curriculum coverage and getting insight in curriculum coverage, and this alignment report is a tool that's very suited for that. If you open alignment report after you have added learning objectives to your course, you would see something like this. Basically, all white boxes for all the learning objectives you've added to your course. But I want to show you what happens with those boxes when you start aligning content to learning objectives. So if I, for example, go to a plan, click Add Learning Objectives, select one or two learning objectives, and insert those to my course, or to my plan in this case, then one thing I've already achieved is that I can now show my students what learning objectives I will work on, or we will work on in this plan. So maybe at the end of this lesson, or in this case it's a week plan, at the end of this week, these are potentially the things you achieve, or these are the things we work towards. But in addition to communicating expectations, when I now switch back to the alignment report, I see two learning objective boxes turn green. Those have now been connected to at least one item. And when I click on the added link here, I can also see which content it is connected to. So in the end, if you want to cover the whole curriculum, you want all of these boxes turned green. And ideally, keeping repetition in mind, they should be connected to more than one resource or plan. Also here, let's jump into the live environment. This is where I left as my teacher, the whole bunch of learning objectives added to my course. If I now jump into plans and add learning objectives, basically the same what we saw in the slides, I can select one or more learning objectives. This is about poems, so let's see if I can find one about poems. Sorry, I think I've picked the wrong one. I should select reading, a variety, and there's one about poetry down the bottom. There it is, with the conventions, and I click insert and close. And as I said, now we are already communicating the expectations. What are we working towards to my students? And if you hover on these learning objectives, you can see the full description. But we were talking about the curriculum coverage report, or the alignment report, as we call it in itslearning. If I now click on that, then I will see two green boxes, just like I saw in the presentation. And from here, if you click on it and you see the content connected to it, you can also jump to it. So what exactly, or how exactly does this look like? And we know that in some countries it's practice to also show to management or to leadership that you are covering all the objectives that you are supposed to teach. So in some countries, this tool, this report, also can be used to that and can quickly give a deep dive in the content used to address these learning objectives. All right, back to the presentation. It's still quiet in the chat, and I still encourage you to ask questions if you have any. Next up, I want to talk about the Learning Objective Repository. I briefly mentioned before that on the add page of a course, you can add or create your own learning objectives. And especially if you just want to try it out, see how it works, that's fine. But if your plan is to use them in multiple courses, maybe in multiple years with other teachers, then I recommend the Learning Objective Repository. because the learning objective repository allows a school, or maybe even the whole site, so it could even be a municipality or local authority, to create their own sets of learning objectives. And this could be used in cases where the objectives you get from the government might be too abstract, too broad, not concrete or specific enough, or are written in a language that's very difficult to understand, that your students don't really have any idea with or about. So this learning objective repository allows you to create a similar structure as what we've seen so far, but then for your own school or your own site. So I'm logged in here as my teacher, Jane. I see now the admin section there, where I have the option to open the learning objective repository. And the first time I would do that would look something like this: the name of my school, if I'm allowed to manage it for my school. But other than that, it's completely empty. Now, let's again jump to the live environment. I see here admin as well, and there the learning objective repository. Now, a small note, even though this is a teacher on this itslearning site, or in this itslearning site, she does have access to the learning objective repository, but that's not the case for all teachers. This is a permission that administrators by default have, system administrators by default have, but it's not something that teachers by default have. So if there is a teacher or a group of teachers that should be able to do this, to manage this, then you can give them access using the profiles or the policies functionality in itslearning. That's something that administrators or system administrators can do. But this teacher has access. So when she clicks on Learning Objective Repository, in this case, she gets to this page, and that's because she can manage this for multiple schools within this site. I'm working with the Neptune College in this demo, so let's select that one. Now, as I mentioned in the presentation, the first time you do this, it will be empty, and you can start populating this. You can do that manually. I can see I can start adding folders, and in those folders, I can start adding subjects, but it's also possible to import the curriculum. I briefly want to do this manually. I will skip folders. Folders are just a way to organize subjects, but you can also directly add subjects to the root folder. And I will not be very creative here. I will just say the itsConvention. The ID here is mandatory. So I can, for example, say it's 1, 2, 3. And if I want to explain the objective further, learning how to work with the learning objective repository, or in students' terms, by the end of this lesson, students will be able to work with the learning objective repository, something in that line. So that's my subject that I now have created, and to that subject, I can start adding learning objectives. And learning objectives, that's the entity, or that's the item you can connect to plans or to assignments, etc. What's common if you have a whole set of learning objectives is to add categories as well. We saw that before with reading and writing. That's just a way to group learning objectives, both when navigating to add learning objectives, but also in reports. For now, we'll just keep it very simple. My learning objective, and I'll just leave it like this. I'll not add any description. One thing I need to do before I make it available is to click publish. So now I'm basically working in draft mode. But when I publish this learning objective, I can go into my course, and I can now also add from this set of learning objectives. So the set is, for this demo, very simple. It is a very short set. So when I click find, what you see now is that it no longer opens in the national repository, but it opens in the repository from my school. I can still go to the national one or even the global one, but by default now I can add from my school. So I can add this itsConvention subject, which will now be available here. It will now also appear in my alignment report, and I can, for example, now also use it. Now let's start with the plan to connect it to a plan. So let's go into itsConvention and connect my learning objective. So also here, if I go back to the alignment report, you will now see it connected to that plan. So that's a way to start with your own framework of learning objectives for your school or your site. Now, creating it manually, that is some work. Maybe you already have a structure in a Word document or something else. So I do want to point out another alternative, and that's to import the curriculum, where you can work with an Excel file to quickly import that structure. So I can briefly show the file to you. And basically what that does, it's the title and description of the entity you want to import. Is it a subject? Is the learning objective a category? So the level to organize learning objectives. Folders, perhaps, you can also create those here. And also, where should I add it to? So this category will be added to this subject. And this learning objective will be added to this category. So you can import a whole structure using this file. And let's just briefly import that sample structure that I just downloaded, called math. And you can see the end result here. So that's a way, especially if you already have something, to relatively quickly bring your structure into itslearning. So back to the presentation. And I'm happy to see that there is a question coming in. So learning objectives haven't been added for our state in Germany. If I enter them manually, can I easily make them available to all my colleagues at my school? So yes, with this learning objective repository, which is available on school level, so the schools in the hierarchy of itslearning, you can manage it for a single school, but you can also manage it for the site, which means all teachers on that site can then add it to their courses. So yeah, the answer is yes. And I do hope that this motivates others to also start asking questions in this chat. So we've seen now learning objectives can come from the national repository, which is managed by itslearning, or the local itslearning organization in your country. You can create them in your own course, which is good if you just want to try it out. Or if you want to create your own learning objectives, you can create them in the learning objectives repository. Great tool also to work together with other teachers to really sit and think, what is it that we want our students to achieve, and how can we explain that and describe that best for our students. Now, we've seen one practice of learning objectives, and that's more the curriculum coverage bit. So being able to see which part of the curriculum of those learning objectives have you connected to content or to plans. You can take it a step further by assessing the learning objectives. And that's a great way to monitor progress. So have my student achieved this goal, or are they maybe underway to achieve those goals? So let's see. I see a question is coming in. Maybe I can pick that one up before I do that. The curriculum for Swedish upper secondary schools cover about 1,000 courses. Do you have any plans to add learning objectives automatically to courses? I do believe, but I need to come back to you on that over email to confirm, but I do believe it is possible to do so via integration to specify which basically part of the learning objective repository should be connected to that course. So I believe there are ways, but I'll come back to you on that to confirm. So continuing on assessing learning objectives. Also here, let's start with some slides in the presentation, but I'll certainly show this live in a bit. For assessment, or I should say assessment of learning objectives, we have a couple of tools available. We have our assignment tool, where students need to submit something, for example, a paper or an essay. We have our task tool, which can be used to plan, but also to assess something that happens outside its learning. For example, a lab experiment or an oral presentation. We have our test tool, which can be used to basically ask questions, multiple choice, open answers, etc. Variety of test questions. And we have what we call the organization API. That's a bit technical, but we have customers that use the organization API to import learning objective assessment done via another system. I will not touch upon that one a lot. It's very specific, but there are options also to integrate this with other systems. So before I dive into those tools, there is one, you could say, tool on itself that can be used in both the task tool as well as the assignment tool to assess learning objectives, and that's the rubric tool or the assessment criteria tool. So what you can do with this is add assessment criteria to learning objectives, and I'll show you where that's done in a bit. You can define achievement levels. Those are the columns, so to speak. So we see below basic, basic, proficient, advanced, where you can have 2 to 6 achievement levels, also with a different label if you choose not to work with below basic and basic, for example. Then it's possible to describe the behavior or what matches that criteria on that level. They're also called descriptors if you read up on rubrics. And as I said, it can be used to communicate expectations in the task tool and assignment tool, but also for assessment. So I'll first go through some of the tools we have, and then I'll go to the live environment to show this in action, also using my student account. So this is the rubric in action in the assignment tool. Write your own poem, that's the assignment. I'm a student here called Eric, and I can see before I start answering the assignment, what are the points that will be looked at when the teacher evaluates or assesses the assignment. What do I need to show if I want to get a great result? What do I need to show if I will get a low result? So that's one way to make it very concrete to students to what it is that will be looked for or looked at when assessing this assignment or this activity. And this rubric, well, can be used to communicate expectations, but can also be used to assess. It can be used to assess by the teacher, but it can also be used to for self-assessment. So students assess themselves using this rubric, or it can be used with peer assessment, where other students are asked to assess, well, each other, and they can also use this rubric as a guidance when assessing. This rubric can be used in the task tool, but another way in the task tool is by directly setting what we call the report status. And this is a direct assessment on the learning objective. I'll show this in a bit, but I'll also show you in a bit how this then comes back in the report. The last tool that can directly be used in itslearning is the test tool. And in the test tool, you can connect learning objectives to questions. And this way, when a student answers those questions, they will automatically be assessed against that learning objective. Especially if the learning objective is much more about knowledge or application. This is a good way to measure that if it's more open skills that a student needs to demonstrate than a tool like the assignment, where they need to go write an essay, for example, or maybe even something outside itslearning. I mentioned the oral presentation. Those are tools that can also be used. So, and the last thing is, of course, the organization API I mentioned before. If you're interested in that, please find all the information on developer.itslearning.com. I will not go into much detail on that in this presentation. So let's jump to my teacher again. And I had a couple of courses prepared, but now I'll fast forward in time and I'll jump to the 6B course, because there I've already worked a bit with rubrics or with learning objectives and assessment criteria. I go back to the learning objective page, and on this page, I will open I should open the writing category. I will click on a learning objective. And what I see now is that creativity and imagery appear. Those are what we call assessment criteria. when I click on this assessment criteria button in the toolbar, this assessment criteria page or rubric page will open. And it will show that I've added 2 criteria to this learning objective about being able to write accurately, fluently, and efficiently. I can add more. It will basically be a new card where I can add the name of my criteria, potentially a description, and the descriptors for each level. For now, I will just delete that one and just work with the ones I've added before. How itslearning works is that it aggregates, so to speak, the assessment criteria from the learning objectives you add to an element. That may sound a bit technical, so let me just show you what I mean. I have this assignment, write your own poem, and I've connected 2 learning objectives to this assignment. So let me just briefly show this as well, because at this point, the only thing I've showed is how to connect learning objectives to a plan. But in this case, I can also connect learning objectives the same way I connect them to my plan. But in this case, I can connect them to my assignment. And there are several tools I can connect learning objectives to. Short side step, because what I wanted to show you is the rubric. Let me just edit this assignment to show you exactly what I mean. Because I've added 2 learning objectives to this assignment. The one I've shown you before about being able to write accurately, fluently, and effectively. But I've also connected the one about applying spelling patterns and rules of something explicitly for the US, for the UK. So I have a grammar criteria here with also a couple of descriptors. So the rubric for this assignment is created based on the 2 learning objectives that are added or have been added to this assignment. So, and now I'll log in as a student and show you how a student can experience these learning objectives. So I go into poetry, my write your own poem assignment. And the first thing I will see here is the rubric itself. So before I start answering the assignment, I can already see what is expected of me and what is needed to get a great grade or a not so great grade. Now, of course, in the interest of time, I will not write an assignment as we speak. I will just paste in an assignment and submit. And in this assignment, I've set up to assess myself. So as I mentioned before, you can also use rubrics in self-assessment or in peer assessment. So I'll click self-assessment here. And there I can use the rubric tool to give myself an assessment. So now to the teacher. What does my teacher see? Briefly need to refresh this assignment since this happened while I had the page open. I can see the student has self-assessed himself. And when I open the assignment, or the answer, I should say, I can see the answer, but I also have the option to view the self-assessment. So here I can see that this student assessed himself proficient on the both criteria for the first learning objective and basic on the second one. And I, as a teacher, can also complete this assessment, can open the rubric, and for example, give my own assessment on this assignment. It is possible to give specific feedback on each criteria if the descriptors in the rubric might not be concrete enough, but I'll just leave them as is. And I'll just save this assignment. So that's the assignment tool and how you can use rubrics to assess, well, the assignment, but also to assess learning objectives. And in a moment, I will also show you how that assessment or those assessments feed into an overview to monitor progress on those learning objectives. But I first want to show you a couple of other tools that can be used for learning objective assessment. One of them is the task tool. I've set up here a classroom discussion, which is basically a placeholder for anything that I find worth noting or worth assessing what's just happening during class. So also here, I can assess on the learning objectives, but in this case, I didn't connect a rubric. I've just allowed to change the status on the learning objective. So perhaps I'm saying this student has met this learning objective. What I've seen in the classroom, how the student speaks English, that meets this criteria. And I save the assessment. Again, how that comes back in the report, how I can monitor progress on the learning objective, I will show you in a bit. But I first want to go to the last tool, which is the test tool. And in this case, let me first open the side panel. I've also connected learning objectives to this test, and I can then, when I add or edit questions, connect a learning objective to those questions. And in this way, let me switch back to my student. If my student starts answering these questions in this test, then itslearning will automatically also measure the proficiency on those learning objectives. So I'll just very quickly answer these questions. This is a lot of work, so I'll just keep that as is. And other than that, I'll do my best to answer this test properly. All right, so I've shown you a couple of tools that can be used to assess learning objectives, and I'll show you in a bit how that ends up in the report. So 4 out of 5 correct. Let me first jump back to my presentation. And I see there is one more question. What's the difference or comments between learning goals and competencies evaluation? I'm not fully familiar with the term competencies evaluation, if there might be something very specific, but in general, competencies, as I mentioned in one of the introduction slides, a competence description can just as well be something that you want your students to achieve. In my definition, a competency is a bit more complex. It usually has a knowledge factor or component, and a skill component, and a behavior or attitude component. But in the end, especially with rubrics, those descriptors are meant to describe, you could say, behavior. What behavior do you need to show to meet that proficiency level? So I would say they are functionality-wise quite the same. I see they are used for professional formation or professional development, probably. Still, the answer is the same. They can very likely be used for that as well. Now, I've used 3 different assessment tools to assess the student, but I've also showed you that I was using rubrics or even connected learning objectives to my test questions to, while assessing the student, also assess those learning objectives. So next up, I want to talk a bit about monitoring progress on those learning objectives. So we've seen in an earlier report how we can monitor curriculum coverage, which part of the curriculum, which learning objectives have I connected to content already, and which haven't I connected to content already. But now I want to show you how you can measure how well your students are doing on these learning objectives. And for that, we're using the Learning Objective Progress Report. Just like the alignment report, it can be found under Status and Follow-up. And it contains several tabs and even several layers on each tab. So these are slightly different learning objectives than what I've worked with so far. These are from the US, Los Angeles even, that's the LA here. But the description is also English, so we can still understand what we're talking about. And I've taken another course just because it takes a lot of time to fill this report with data. So I just took the benefit of already having a report ready for this. So what we see here is a whole set of learning objectives grouped by whatever category structure they are in. I can see how many students currently meet this objective, how many, how many do not meet the objective, how many I still need to assess on this learning objective. And I also see something called mastery percentage. Now that mastery percentage is something optional. I'll come back to that in a bit. But from here, I can click on the learning objective. So I'm now zooming in on this learning objective. And there I can see the status for each individual student. So for example, I see Ragnar here, I still need to assess, but I also see that Inga does not meet this objective yet. So I should likely give her some more opportunities to work on this objective. Another tab, participants, gives you a view on the individual student. So how many of the objectives does the student currently meet or does not meet? How many do I yet have to assess? And again, this mastery percentage, which I will come back to in a bit. I can click on a student to see individual details. So this learning objective has been assessed twice, I can see in this graph. The first time, the student did not meet this objective yet, but the second time he did. So things are progressing nicely. And when I zoom in even further, open the learning objectives, then I can even see the different assessments for this learning objective for this student. Yeah, basically that. So let me again jump into the live environment and jump to the teacher. So go to status and follow-up, the learning objective progress report. And I've worked, for example, with writing, where I have assessed one student. So I can now see that this learning objective starts to have progress indicators, while everything that I haven't assessed at all yet will not show that, just to keep the report a bit more clean. So if I click on this learning objective, I see that Eric already has met this objective. When I zoom in even further, I can see it's the assignment, write your own poem, that has given the student this assessment. You can also see the assessment I have given. So we have an assessment history, so far only one, but if you have multiple assessments on this learning objective, you can zoom in on that. And we have an alignment table here as well. So you can see that there is a plan about writing your own poem and there is an assignment, but basically all the content this student has had the opportunity to come in contact with is visible in this report. So the other way, participants view, I can see here that Eric has been assessed, the others I haven't assessed yet. And I can, for example, just click on the assessments that the student now meets and the report will filter. So I, for example, see this one, which comes back to the classroom discussion, which I've checked. What else do we have here? Which one do I not meet yet? My grammar, which comes from the rubric assessment. So again, if I zoom in, you can see indeed it's write your own poem. This part of the assignment I do not, this student does not meet yet. And then we have this one, I believe, is about the test. So also the test tool has fed into the report here. So back to the presentation. No new questions. So I'll just continue here. So you've seen some terms in the report. You've seen meets, does not meet. You've seen mastery. That might be terminology or that might be a practice that you do not use. So there are setup options to create or configure these reports to match your practice or your vision. So if you go as administrator or system administrator to itslearning, again, that is a user right, so technically all users could do this. You can go to manage settings for learning objective reports. And in there are a couple of choices that can be made. The first one is the use of mastery. That was that blue bar we've seen. And mastery basically means that or can be used to measure a learning objective more than once in a way to avoid flukes. So especially if you use a test tool, student could get lucky, just guess the wrong questions. What you could do with mastery, especially with the recurrence rules we see here down below, is setting up rules to say you need at least 2 times a meet assessment for this learning objective before we check it off. So it's an additional level to ensure that the assessments the student has on these reports is correct. But other than that, you can define up to 5 levels in the report. So if you need more than the 2 does not meets, you can define those, and you can also change the name of those settings that you use. It does work under the hood with percentages. So for each level, you can define a percentage. But also for each assessment, it is possible as teacher to overrule the suggested assessment. So for example, when you assess with a rubric, itslearning will suggest an outcome on the learning objective, but you as a teacher can always overrule that. Now this may get a bit very specific by now, especially if this is all new to you. Just know it's there. That's the main point here. So if what you've seen in the report so far in this session does not meet your vision, know that there are ways to configure that to make it more closer to what you had in mind. So the last topic I want to briefly zoom into is advanced reporting, and this again might be a bit complex, a bit too advanced. So I want to quickly go through this, mainly to show you that it's there, and that if you start to invest time in learning objectives, that this is an additional layer that you can get out of it. And basically what that layer is a way for school leaders or other stakeholders to get insight on both curriculum coverage, so the coverage of learning objectives or alignment of learning objectives, but also learning objective progress or assessment across courses, across teachers, across schools. So if it's more the policy of the school to work with learning objectives, it is a way for them, for example, to see are there learning objectives that students are struggling with all teachers. So, and that maybe means that we need to look at our curriculum, at the content we are using there, and replace that with other content. At least we need to revisit what's happening there. So different questions can be answered with advanced reporting. I will not go in details here. I will also not go live in here. I'll just show you some of the pictures that will give you an idea what this report or what these reports give you. This is a add-on, by the way, so this is not something that's by default available, something I paid for, a module, so to speak. But it can give you very valuable insight once you've started using learning objective in force with several teachers in several courses, potentially over several schools. So for example, here a division over the different schools on the site, the different subjects from the learning objective repository. Zooming further in, even on individual students here, on the individual learning objectives. On average, the students meeting and not meeting your learning objectives. That's just one report, and we have the alignment report, which shows you how content is aligned, how much content is aligned, which schools are aligning content. Also here some visuals. I'm not diving into the details here, but just to show you that once you've started investing in learning objectives, that is a lot of additional information that you can get out of itslearning. Now, I do see that an additional question has popped up. So let's see, it's a long question, so I need to increase my screen a bit. So the Swedish curriculum of upper secondary schools have 3 levels of learning goals: content, abilities, and knowledge. These 3 not match exactly, and the knowledge are primarily used to assess student work. So learning also import all of these as learning goals. Well, this is actually a change we did for Sweden, because this is Swedish curriculum. What we've done in the report here is actually not showing the status for all learning objectives, only show the progress status for learning objectives once there actually is an assessment. So that's the way that's actually a change we made for the Swedish curriculum because of this division. So I'm not sure if that fully addresses the question. Of course, also in the planner, you can have multiple, I've only used one learning objective column, but you could work with multiple learning objectives columns. So that might be a way to separate that. But yeah, I think in general, this is familiar. We've made some changes to the product years ago, to be honest. And if there's a need to further discuss this, suggest to first reach out to the subsidiary, and they can discuss their findings then with me or a fellow product owner. I hope you've learned something today, that you are inspired to start working with learning objectives yourself. And other than that, I wish you a very pleasant day. Stay safe, and I'll keep the question bar open a bit longer, just to make sure that everybody has the time to finish writing their questions. So if you don't have a question, then you're free to leave. And I thank you very much for your attention, and have a nice day.